My name is John Perrell, and I'm the director of the Friends of Smithsonian. So I was trying to think about what I was going to say tonight, and what really came to me was that coming to American history is sort of a homecoming for me. It's kind of quirky, kind of corny to say that, but this goes back to my 8th grade class trip in 1981. How many of you came on a class trip or came with your family to American history? Not surprising. Actually, 93% of our members and donors have been to Smithsonian, which is a testament to the organization. The interesting fact about that is over 60% of those who have visited haven't been in over 20 years. So it's that connection to that experience that really drives their passion for the organization. And so we have members across the whole nation. It's incredible. So going back to my class trip, for anybody who did that, it's an incredible trip because it's literally the first time I think that you go on a trip without your parents. And it's exciting. And so, you know, it's this crazy week where you're going to Capitol Hill and the monuments, but you get to go to Smithsonian. And it's American history, natural history, and air and space are really I think the 3 big museums we went to. And for me, it was American history. I hated American history before that. I loved European history, I loved Asian history, but coming here really drove it home for me, made it interesting for me, brought it to life for me. So now, I live here, and like you tonight, I have the privilege of being able to come here often, every day. And so when my mother comes here now, or when family members come, you know, my mother, she loves American history, and so when I go with her here, we have our stops that we have to do. And you all know you can't come to this museum and do it in one day. It's impossible. But we always come and see Kermit. And Miss Piggy is reunited with Kermit here. And for us, that's a collective memory that we have. Of watching the Muppet Show at 7 p.m. on Saturday nights. We go and see the First Lady's gowns. And for my mother, that's about American royalty. That's about Jackie O and Camelot. It makes her smile. When we were here, when she was here last time, we came and there was when you come in, there's the whole thing about the World's Fair. Was it 1964? Does anybody know if that's the year it was for? And the Mustang is there. And of course, you know, my mom was in her 20s. It was prior to having children. And so, again, good memories. We also go to see Julia Child's Kitchen. We also go to see Julia Child's Kitchen. And for me, that is my father. It's the memory of my father. His passion for cooking was driven by Julia Child. And so we get to remember my dad. Those are my memories. I know you all have memories of that. And I hope that, you know, coming here tonight brings back some of those memories. I hope that this evening is going to give you a little bit of the behind the scenes of how exhibitions come to life. It's no surprise probably to you all who are very engaged with us that there's an army behind the scenes. So for every little object or every research project that we do, there is a team behind that. There are volunteers behind that. It's an amazing partnership. I've gone way off on my notes here. So I want to thank all of our James Smithson Society members, our Castle Circle members, and our Friends of Smithsonian for coming tonight. You are partners in this enterprise, and you help bring Smithsonian to life. If you don't know, there's a lot of excitement happening at American History this year. Last summer was the bicentennial of the Star-Spangled Banner. This summer, the West Wing opens on July 1st. One of the hallmark exhibitions there will be American Enterprise. And that's about the interaction of capitalism and democracy and how it changed the American landscape. Tonight's talk and exhibition viewing is a perfect example of that. Hear My Voice, Alexander Graham Bell, and the Origins of Recorded Sound explores the work of one of America's greatest inventors and how Smithsonian's partnership across many organizations allows us to hear his early recordings from the past. It is my pleasure now to introduce you to our speaker for tonight, Carlene Stevens. She is the curator in the division, and listen to this, the Division of Work and Industry at the National Museum of American History. Her responsibilities include care of the museum's historical collections of clocks, watches, objects related to sound recordings, locks, and robots. Now, that's pretty cool. I kind of want that job. Among the many exhibitions she has worked on, you have maybe seen this one. It's Time and Navigation, the untold story of getting from here to there, which is going on at the National Air and Space Museum. So again, great partnership across our organization. Please welcome Carlene.
Thank you, John. Hello, everybody. Or maybe I should say ahoy, because that's what Alexander Graham Bell proposed should be the answer when you picked up a ringing telephone. Instead of saying hello, he proposed ahoy. I'm actually kind of glad that didn't catch on. Well, thank you very much for coming this evening, for giving me this opportunity to talk. And my purpose is to give you a little bit of backstory on how we came to have the exhibition on the second floor, Hear My Voice, that you're going to have an opportunity to see in a little while. My colleague, Sherry Stout, and I have been working with partners outside the museum. I'm sorry, I'm moving the furniture here. We have partners at the Library of Congress, and we have partners at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in Berkeley, California. And they've been helping us recover sound from some of the earliest audio, the earliest sound recording ever made. And our efforts so far have focused on about a dozen experimental recordings made between 1881 and 1885 in Alexander Graham Bell's Volta Laboratory here in Washington, D.C. If you don't know where the Volta Laboratory was, today the address is 1221 Connecticut Avenue, and there's the Lucky Bar and Julia's Empanadas on the spot. Has anybody been to the Lucky Bar? A couple of hands, okay. In my presentation today, I'd like to describe for you the ongoing sound recovery project. I'm going to report some results to date, and I'm going to actually play some mediated 19th century audio for you. And then I'd also like to offer some preliminary thoughts about the implications of reviving sound from these recordings. And it's a process that basically transformed mute artifacts sitting in the storage room, untouched for decades, and it transformed these artifacts to eloquent voices that may actually guide scholars to what one of them has called the audible past, a part of the past we have not heard from before. So the dozen recordings that we've focused on so far are just the tip of the iceberg. It's a small part of a unique Smithsonian collection of about 500 artifacts that document the birth of sound recording and playback. It's the work of Bell, Alexander Graham Bell. It's the work of Thomas Edison. And it's also the work of another Washingtonian, Emil Berliner, other pioneers in the field. So here's the iceberg that I mentioned. It's our sound recording storage cabinet that you can see some of the Volta contents there, and you can see my colleague, our collections manager in the division. Her name is Sherry Stout. Most of the Volta laboratory recordings, and there are, as I say, about 400 of them, Most of these recordings and the apparatus from the Volta laboratory came to the Smithsonian about a century ago in two separate gifts from Alexander Graham Bell himself. With only one or two exceptions, these recordings have been considered unplayable until recently. And the arrival of Irene. Irene is the equipment name, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But before we get too deep into our sound recovery project, which is actually kind of thrilling research, I want to talk a little bit about Alexander Graham Bell and the Smithsonian. You likely already know that Bell was more than the inventor of the telephone. He was a gifted researcher. He had a special interest in the physiology and the pathology of hearing and speech, language. And he was a Smithsonian regent. He was a long-time Smithsonian regent from 1898 to 1922. He's best remembered, I think, at the Smithsonian as the eminent escort for James Smithson's bones. He went to Genoa, Italy, brought them back to Washington in 1904. He also provided seed money to the Astrophysical Observatory. He clinched the Freer donation, gave a considerable number of objects to document his own career to the National Museum. As a regent, he was very close friends with Secretary Samuel Langley, and they did experiments in aeronautics together. Bell's special interest was in very large kites, bigger than some airplanes. And Paul Garber, SI's very first aeronautical curator, remembered that when he was just a youngster, his neighbor, Mr. Bell, showed him the right way to tie a kite. So today, my focus is actually on the Smithsonian's intersections with Bell as a young man, a young inventor. He's pretty handsome, isn't he? At the age of 28, Bell visited the Smithsonian's first secretary, Joseph Henry, for advice on how to build a telephone. That was in 1875. A year later, he had his first patent. In the process of getting to know the Smithsonian, he built a custom wind gauge for another secretary, Secretary Baird. And Baird was Bell's helper in still one more incident in a very unusual way. On 3 separate occasions, in 1880 and 1881, Bell and his associates at the laboratory here in Washington entrusted the Smithsonian with 3 sealed tin boxes to document the lab's work on sound recording. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. You may not think of Washington, D.C. as a hotbed of inventive activity, but the 1880s was in fact a decade of hyper activity in experimental sound right here in Washington, D.C. It was the subject of a lot of inventive fervor. It was the era's new media. If you think back a couple of years on our new media, the environment, the atmosphere was the same. Paradoxically, it's also a decade, the decade of the 1880s, from which the present day has almost no sounds because the recordings are considered unplayable. So I think there's not going to be a test on this, but I just really want to give you a quick background timeline. So I don't expect you to keep the syllables of these machines straight. It's phonograph, graphophone, gramophone, but the players are kind of important, and the timeline is kind of important. 1857, a Frenchman, a French typographer and stenographer, Léon Scott de Martinville, invents a machine that he calls the phonograph, and it is the first machine to ever record sound. It can't play it back, but it can record it. Okay, now today that sounds ridiculous, and I know, but he had this idea. He's a typographer, he's a stenographer. He sees writing, and he thinks if he got enough recordings of sound on sooted paper, which is how this machine worked, it made a record, he thought if he had enough pieces of paper that showed, for example, how a famous opera singer looked on paper, how the sound looked on paper, it would be possible to start to study and extract excellence, to know from this piece of paper what an excellent sound came from or what it looked like. So then along comes Thomas Edison, 1877, and amazes the world, quite literally, amazes the world, gets the reputation of the Wizard of Menlo Park, largely on the basis of inventing the phonograph, the very first machine ever to record and play back sound. It's almost impossible for us today to imagine a world where there is no recorded sound. If you think about all the sound that you hear in a day, broadcasting, radio, TV, or portable music players, even in the grocery store, when you're trying to buy frozen fish, you hear the music coming through the sound system. So imagine 1877, the impact of a device that records and plays back sound for the first time ever. But it's not very good. Edison demonstrated his machine, caused a lot of interest. His recording medium was a piece of tinfoil wrapped around a drum, embossed by a needle that was responding to a moving diaphragm. And after a couple of after a couple of times of playing back, the tinfoil just didn't hold up. So along come the Volta Associates. Gardner Green Hubbard is one of Edison's principal investors, and he's also Alexander Graham Bell's father-in-law. And you can imagine the conversation. He turns to his son-in-law and he says, "Can't you improve this?" And so, in fact, that's what the Volta Laboratory did. And then I promised you another Washingtonian. Emil Berliner comes along with the gramophone and basically figures out a way to produce commercially available disc records. The graphophone of the Volta Lab is a cylinder record. Okay, so that's the timeline. And as I say, there's no test. But I'm going to focus now on this part of the timeline with the Volta Associates. What I'd like to say a little bit now is about going inside the Volta Lab and what did we learn from going inside and playing these recordings. First of all, we started our project to recover sound from the NMAH Volta recordings without knowing very much about the Volta Lab. There's a little bit of research that's been done about it, but how many people here knew that Alexander Graham Bell was involved in sound recording? Oh, that's a good bunch. That's good. Okay. Well, you're way ahead of me in this. So we also had to find out whether this specialized equipment called Irene could actually get sound from our weird recordings. Irene was developed at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in response to a dire need that every archive across the country, around the world has. There are millions of endangered commercial recordings that are past media for which there are fewer and fewer ways of getting sound from them. So Irene is a non-contact process that basically converts the sound in these mechanical cylinders and disc records into a digital file. But we didn't know if the Volta recordings would be good with Irene because they are all kinds of very weird configurations, materials, states of disrepair. So we found among these 400 or so recordings, I have a list there, the photographic glass plate, wax on cardboard, wax on brass, copper, corroded copper, and then all these layer cakes of foil and plaster and wax, sometimes all together and sometimes just very badly worn, very poorly surviving the centuries. So no standard format here is my point. No 33, 45, 78 in any of this, okay? So we're experimenting with a 21st century technology on 19th century experiments is kind of the bottom line there. For the third thing, we learned that the present Volta project connects to Smithsonian history in a material way. I mentioned earlier the deposit of the tin boxes at the Smithsonian, and we learned much more about these tin boxes that were kept in the secret vault. On 3 occasions, February 28, 1880, April 6, 1880, and October 30th, 1881, the Volta Associates, that's Bell, his cousin Chichester Bell, and Charles Sumner Taylor, they deposit these sealed tin boxes at the Smithsonian. And the first 2 boxes, I don't want to say they're inconsequential, they contain things pertaining to the photophone, which was not a sound recording device, but a forerunner of transmitting a message on a beam of light, like fiber optics. Bell considered the photophone his greatest achievement, even more so than the telephone. So there you see the boxes, the photophone. But relevant to the story today was another box which had a tin lid, and inside that was the very first prototype graphophone, a recording separate from the graphophone, and then all kinds of documentation. Copy pages of their notebooks, of their experiments, newspapers that indicated the very day they sealed up the boxes, and signed affidavits that they had worked on these things and when they had worked on it. And all of this was done in the event that there was a patent fight. By the time Bell was done, I read, he had between 600 and 800 challenges to his telephone patent. He spent a lot of his time, or his lawyers spent a lot of time fighting those patents, and so fighting to preserve his patent. So in the case of his sound recording materials, he was ready. He had the evidence in the box. Nobody needed those pieces of evidence. There never was a patent fight that required it. And so these things, artifacts and documents, sat in these tin boxes till 1937, when they were opened in the presence of Bell's two daughters, you can see them there, his great-grandson, the head of the Dictaphone Corporation, because eventually the Volta laboratory cylinder records and machines turn into the Dictaphone Corporation, and also representatives of the Smithsonian, that's Secretary Abbott. Okay. So everything that I've just told you requires all kinds of deeper analytical commentary. It's just that for now, I think what you really probably want to do is hear some of these sounds. So there's a picture of Irene and our partners. I'm going to get to the sounds right now. And this is how Irene works. There won't be a quiz on this either. But it's basically a two-step process where with a very high-resolution microscope, there is a scan of the surface, and then the computer program creates a virtual stylus and plays through a virtual groove and fills in any broken skips, cracks, and so forth. You know, on these mechanical carriers, the sound is in the groove. It doesn't work. Irene doesn't work on anything electronic. And I should credit our main partners again, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, Library of Congress, funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, Smithsonian Institution Scholarly Studies, an internal fund here. We had a grant from the Grammy Foundation and also from the Lemelson Center here in American History. So we did have some success with Irene on our sound recordings, and those weird materials that I told you about earlier yielded some really weird sound. The big photographic plate on the left there is the word barometer over and over and over. Some unidentified male voice saying barometer, barometer. And then the white wax record is a very long reading. Somebody, again, unidentified, has a journal of the day, and he's just reading from it. The green wax record is Hamlet, to be or not to be. The little number 4, little green copper thing, is from the tin box, and it's a male voice counting from 1 to 6. It's very exciting. And the number 5, another glass plate, recorded with a beam of light through a jet of liquid in a very Rube Goldberg-esque style of sound recording, is what our partner at Lawrence Berkeley Lab calls the first recording of disappointment. They start their experiment, they identify who they are, they say the date, and they start into Mary Had a Little Lamb, and something goes terribly wrong. And experts differ about the sound when something goes wrong. You can hear it upstairs. I don't know if I didn't bring it, but you can hear it in the exhibit upstairs and make up your own mind if it's an expletive or not. And then they restart and they do Mary Had a Little Lamb again. So I'm going to play these now. Okay, I think I'm going to play these. I'm going to start with the little green copper one. Can anybody in the audience do a trilled R for me? That's it. Okay, great. I can't do that. But they use that sound repeatedly because it's strong and piercing, and there's no question that that's what you're hearing. The rest of it is very difficult to understand. which is why I have transcripts on the screen. It's not, I apologize, it is not high fidelity. It is late 19th century sound. Okay, here we go. Now, you know that Alexander Graham Bell's family was from Scotland, right? And his father and his grandfather were both elocutionists. We don't know who the speaker here is, but you can imagine that trilled R is also very important in their world. Okay, here's the Mary Had a Little Lamb. And there's also a question here, is it fleece as white as snow, or is it fleece is black as soot? You decide. Again, they don't want to have something that you're anticipating hearing. They want to make sure you're hearing it, you're really hearing it. Can you actually make it out? Okay. All right. All right. So then we got to a point where we could actually identify speakers. This is the graphophone from the tin box. You saw it in the picture when the box was opened in 1937. It has a great big white plastic wheel on it here to enable it to be scanned. This is the voice of Alexander Melville Bell, Alexander Graham Bell's father. And you can read the transcript, you can read along with him. Lots of Shakespeare. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get to that. Okay. The cursor decided to leave early. Well, for goodness sake. Sorry. Here we go.
There are more things in heaven and earth, holy, that are gratified in our philosophy. I am a black person, and my father was a turnover.
That was supposed to be a joke. But it's actually an Edison phonograph that they've converted into their graphophone. It's quite literally an Edison machine that they altered. Okay. And then we actually got the only known recording of Alexander Graham Bell's voice. There is no one alive today who actually heard him speak. His last relative who had heard him speak died recently, and she was over 100. So this recording takes a little explanation. That's a very long piece of paper with a transcript of what he's saying, and it's numbers. He starts counting, 1, 2, 3. I won't do it, but you get the idea. Then he goes 10, 20, 30. And at the bottom, he starts saying dollar amounts, $10 and a half, $13.52. And the idea here is to prove, again, these are all experimental records. The idea here is to prove that this machine and its capabilities is going to be good enough for business dictation. Bell, even Edison, thought that their machines were destined to be dictating equipment for the business world. So there's this long list of numbers, and at the bottom is this critical piece of information. The transcript is there. And he uses the word record. He says, this record was made. I don't know if that was common at that time. There's lots we still don't know, but he's not saying this whatever. He's saying this record, which is what I called these things when I was a kid. So I'm going to play this now, if I can find that cursor again. And he says where the record was made, he says who he is, and then at the end he says, "Hear my voice," which is where we got the title for the exhibition upstairs.
This record has been made by Alexander Graham Bell in the presence of Dr. Christopher Bell on the 15th of April, 1885, at the Volta Laboratory, 1221 Elizabeth Avenue, Washington, D.C., in witness thereof, here in my house. Alexander Graham Bell.
So what do you think? There's lots more to do on this. As I say, we have just scratched the surface, or we try not to scratch the surface, actually. Bad expression to use at this point. We'd like to do many more sound recoveries. We've done 12 out of 400. We'd like to get Irene here on the campus. The Lawrence Berkeley Lab custom makes them, and we have enough work around the entire Smithsonian that we could do this. We have already started to get a parade of researchers who are interested in what we're finding, who's saying what, how are they saying it, what does it mean for the history of recorded sound. Shakespeare scholars, 2 of them, have already wondered what does it mean that there is so much Shakespeare in just these dozen recordings. And of course we have the exhibition upstairs that you will be able to see. And in case you want to know more, there is a website, and I've put it on this last slide. You can also find it by putting "Hear My Voice" in the search engines. I'm going to stop there. There's lots more I could tell you, but do you have any questions? Yes, sir.
Please wait for the microphone.
Give some notes, just quickly.
Oh, sorry.
Just a few notes about question and answers. For those who are watching online, hello out there, you can send your question to askfriends@si.edu. For those who are here in attendance, if you have a question in the auditorium, please raise your hand and wait until a microphone is passed to you. We want to make sure that all the questions can be heard online, and we're also recording this for people to access on our website. Thank you.
Okay, I wonder if the use of the word record there is not ambiguous. It seems to me that it is. Because it could be referring to the medium on which that record was made, or it could be referring to the content. Since we refer to business records and accounting records and whatnot, so he might have been, this record of that information was made by, rather than this content holding device of a phonograph record. Just a question or comment.
No, I think that's a very smart way to look at this. I like the ambiguity of it. I mean, you're not troubled by the ambiguity of it, no. And we... I don't
think that was necessarily crowning the word record is.
Right. What we say in the main label to the exhibition upstairs is that with the advent of sound recording, we get a whole new kind of document to help us understand American history. So, yes. Anybody else?
I'm not familiar with the Irene technology, but if they were aware of the mechanics of the recording device, they could try to invert some of the effects of actually the microphone that was being used. In the 1970s, there were reproductions of Caruso's voice, done at the University of Utah laboratories, I believe, where they were in effect on the boundary between synthesizing the voice based on what they had of the recording and knowing about his voice versus actually trying to capture what they had in the recording. Does the Irene device attempt in its computation to undo that? Because what we're hearing is very much the character of the sound you would have gotten playing it back on some device at that time. In other words, they could do more work on that sound if you wanted to make it sound more normal today, but it would be artificially so in some sense.
I wish my partners from Lawrence Berkeley Lab were here to answer that. For every recording that they recover sound from, we get multiple files, and there is various treatment reflected in each of those files. Some of them are raw, just right off the surface. They are not claiming that the sound is unmediated. It's definitely sound played back by a modern technique. We don't come close to getting the actual sound of the playback unless we play it back in the style that it was originally played back. And we've decided we don't want to do that because the seeds of destruction are in that. The stylus on the surface removes a little bit of the record every time. We probably will never know exactly what it sounds like. In the case of the graphophone with the wax on the cylinder, we know that the playback was not with a stylus. They shot a jet of air at it. And there's no real description of how that differed from playing it back with a stylus. And that's the kind of thing that I would like to know. But that's a very good question. Did I answer? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yes, sir.
From the gramophone or the phonogram, how long did it take for the telephone? And how does the invention of the telephone relate to this work?
The first part of the question is, what's the timeline with the telephone to this? And then the second part is, do they relate? How do they relate? Okay, so the timeline is telephone first. Patent is 1876. Bell's research on sound, trying to understand sound, predates the telephone. He's interested in human speech and hearing. And in 1874, he is teaching the deaf in Boston. And he's using the acoustics laboratory, the physics laboratory, basically, at what is today MIT. And he's using Leon Scott's phonautograph at the MIT acoustics lab, and he's seeing sound waves on a piece of glass. And he's seeing a device, this phonautograph, behaving like an ear. It has a diaphragm that's responding to sound waves, just like a human eardrum. And from that observation, he does two things. He makes his own. He makes his own phonautograph, but he uses the ear of a cadaver because he wants to get as close to human hearing as possible. And the second thing he does is he gets the idea for the telephone because of the sound waves reacting with a diaphragm. So he turns to the telephone, and with money that he wins from the French government, he sets up the laboratory here in town. And the sound recording experiments, sound experiments resume in 1879, 1880 when he sets up the laboratory. They're not all for sound recording, but the sound recording gets going in earnest in 1881, and it's interrupted in the summer of 1881 by the bullets in President Garfield. Alexander Graham Bell invents basically a metal detector that he is trying to find these bullets in Garfield in the summer of 81. And then when Garfield dies, unfortunately, the sound recording experiments resume. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yes, ma'am. Oh.
Yeah, I was wondering, what does Irene stand for? Why is it called Irene? How many Irenes are there? And can we get one?
I'll answer the last question first. Can we get one? I hope so. The Irene stands for image, which is the scanning, reconstruct, rebuild the surface, erase, noise, etc. And it emerged, Carl Haber was listening to an NPR report about the endangered sound recording collections across the country. I think Mickey Hart was talking, from the Grateful Dead, was talking about how sound recordings are endangered. And Carl wondered if the imaging techniques that he uses as a physicist in his experiments, he builds instrumentation for experiments like at the Large Hadron Collider outside of Geneva. He wondered if the same instrumentation might be put into the service of the sound recordings. So at the moment, there is an Irene at Berkeley Lab. There's an Irene downtown here at Library of Congress. There's an Irene at Library of Congress Culpeper AV campus. There's one at the New England Document Conservation Center. This is new, and now they're actually servicing, they're taking clients, the work from clients in the New England region. And there's a portable one in India. They were making one for Moscow Conservatory until diplomatic relations went south. So how many was that? 5? Yes. And I hope we can get one. Is that it? You've been a great audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlene. I'm kind of blown away. This is pretty impressive. Again, thank you for talking, Carlene. Everyone here is invited to go up to the second floor to walk through this exhibition. Carlene has generously agreed to spend some time in the exhibition to answer any specific questions you may have. You may also want to visit the American Stories exhibition and the just opened Through the African American Lens, a preview of the National Museum of African American History and Culture exhibit. Thank you for coming and enjoy your visit.